So, eating data byte by byte. So, if you look in your agenda, I don't know if any of you noticed this, but if you look in your agenda, it says data is the flux capacitor of agricultural research. Anyone know what the flux capacitor is? Oh, wow, I'm so impressed. That's Back to the Future. My goodness, I am impressed. This was a real Generation X thing. But the flux capacitor is from Back to the Future. Great Scott. My favorite film. I'm trying to get my kids to like it as much as I do. So the flux capacitor, it's what enables you to travel through time. And so this is something where I think here in CIAT, we're forever pioneers. It's an area where we're pretty convinced that the future is definitely digital. So this is a nice little infographic I like to show. It's kind of this technological utopia of a farm in the future, you know, and you'll see all sorts of things. You've got survey drones, you've got this fleet of agribots, smart tractors, they're driving themselves, they already do. Texting cows, a personal favorite of mine, but it's actually, yeah, I mean, cows that are sending information, they've got GPSs, sending information about how hot they are, how they're feeling, where they are, etc. Farming data, the farmer sat at the desk, not with a hoe in hand, but rather at the desk, managing, right? Managing the farm. So, you know, this is the kind of technological utopia. The strange thing is you go out there and actually all of these things exist. This is not crazy. This already exists, right? This is something, it was far more impressive when I saw it the first time because it was moving. It was a video, and I haven't been able to, I'm a little bit technologically challenged. I couldn't get the video for this, but you now have these tractors and you have these sensors and things where the tractor moves along. At the front of it, it's detecting every single little plant. It's taking an image. It figures out a plant, and it figures out, well, is that the lettuce that the farmer's growing, or is that a weed? Once it finds out in real time, AI does all of the image analysis. It figures out where are the weeds, and then it does a little squirt, a targeted little squirt of herbicide to kill the weed. This exists. This is now on the back of hundreds of tractors around the world. And so it's incredible. And so much of this kind of, I've been to these tech meetings, and so much of the movement in this sphere is around, like, you know, sticking stuff on your tractor that is using data, using technology. Now, you know, that's a very, you know, so far everything has been very much on the farm side of stuff. Feed the Future have a lovely, this great graphic kind of all the different things where kind of digitizing the agricultural value chain of what you can do, you know, and it's not just here in the kind of on-farm production side, but also post-harvest, access to markets, it goes on, and you can see all these entry points for digitalization. But the fact of the matter is, this is a McKinsey report from a few months back. Agriculture is number 23 out of 23 sectors in terms of digitalization, taking advantage of digital opportunities. And so, you know, this is in the USA where we have tractors and texting cows and all of these things. It's where we have already made huge leapfrogs ahead in terms of digitalization, but it's still lagging behind in the US, right? You know, so this is the reality of the food system. There are 570 million farms in the world, 72% are smaller than 1 hectare, and that the 80% of food is produced on farms that are 2 hectares or less. So this is, you know, the technology at the moment is astonishing, but so many of the graphics and the visions and the tech right now is to strap onto your tractor. It's very much with that kind of vision of a large-scale commercial, heavily mechanized agriculture. So we get excited about, well, what's the translation? So I think this is a fundamental role of the CGIAR, thinking, well, what's the translation of this in a kind of developing agriculture context? Not necessarily the smallest of the smallest farms or the poorest of the poorest, but in the 72% of farms that are producing, you know, 80% of the food here. So we see kind of 4 major changes that get us very excited that I think will be some game changers. One is this, phones, right? My phone's been vibrating violently in my pocket, so the tweet went out and it's working. So, but you know, so you all have your phones. Is there anyone here without a phone? Joe, You see? He couldn't WhatsApp Lily because he doesn't have a phone. Joe is a unique, and I admire him for that, actually. But 6 billion people have mobile phones. More people have access to a mobile phone than they have access to a toilet. Yeah? So that's a phenomenal statistic. And it's changing constantly in terms of it's increasing, and those phones are getting smarter. You know, so you know, I would go to the field often, and it would always be me there with originally my digital camera, and then it was with you know, I'd use my smartphone, and I'd take photos of farmers and the things they're doing, and all this nice rice crop and so on, and you know, that was the way I would visit the field. Now what happens is I go there, and I'm stood kind of talking and asking questions, and everyone's taking photos of me as the researcher, the visitor kind of in their farm. And so it's completely shifted around. The amount of smartphones now in rural villages is fundamentally different. So that's one game changer, right? A second is satellites. So I've been working, I'm a geospatial kind of person originally, scientist, and I've been very interested in kind of satellites over the years, but it's always been a struggle in the ag sector to use it, right? The pixels are too big, it doesn't return, there's too much cloudiness, you don't get another image until the cropping season's already over. It's just riddled with problems, right? And so it's for the last 17 years, it's been there, but it really hasn't worked. It's not been fit for purpose for agriculture. But that, I think, right now has fundamentally changed. So there's more than 2,271 satellites. This is kind of every month rapidly going up. Huge amount of information being generated at very nice spatial resolutions. It's not just public, it's private as well. John Hamer was talking about this a little bit yesterday. And so this is really revolutionizing. You know, this is a nice example of digital globe in Syria in 2011, 2012, 2013, using satellite imagery in places where you really don't necessarily want to go and send your survey unit out to go and check. But this is looking at, for example, what is the crop health and the crop inventories across kind of conflict areas in Syria. Amazing amount of information. You can see individual fields and get forecasts now in terms of productivity, all sorts of things. Huge area that is changing. A third kind of game changer for me is these smart, cheap sensors and the Internet of Things. So you can now buy a soil moisture little probe for $1, stick it kind of almost just grab a handful, throw them out into a field, and you can be monitoring continuously what's going on in terms of soil moisture. You have things like Raspberry Pi to hack together kind of monitoring systems. You have the price of these things has massively gone down, and now you have Internet of Things. You don't need cables. It's all talking using the Internet of Things. So Colombia, for example, is installing an Internet of Things network, right? So you know about Wi-Fi networks. You go around trying to get Wi-Fi. You try and get signal with your, except Joe, with your cell phone. And but there's actually another signal out there, which is Internet of Things, which allows all of these domestic appliances, sensors to talk to each other. And 65% of Colombia is going to have a network of Internet of Things. You won't be able to see it with your devices, but it's out there. And so these little soil moisture probes can connect to it and start reporting. That's fundamentally changing how we generate data in the field as well. And then the fourth one is analytical capacity. So our ability to make sense of data, right? So I always love to show this, mainly because it makes me look way more intelligent than I really am. But this is an example of how analytical capacity is changing a little bit how we go about management research or agronomic research, right? You know, the classic way is we set up an experimental field, we control all variables except the one we want to vary to understand the response. That's been the kind of paradigm of agricultural research for probably over a century. And so now what we can do is we can deal, the problem we were doing that is because there's so many variables changing that it was just impossible to make sense of it. So now with analytical capacity, we can kind of see through that. We can see signals through all of the noise. We can have all of these variables kind of changing at the same time, but if we've got enough data points, and those data points don't need to be experimental fields, they need to be farmers' fields. There's 570 million farms who are all researchers, they're all scientists, they're all experimenting, they're all doing different things. Plug into that and understand and figure out signals. And so we've been doing this with a number of crops here in Colombia, with CIAT up in Mexico, that kind of helps us understand these non-linear responses and the factors that are driving crop yield variability in kind of the real world out there in farmers' fields. So, these are the 4 kind of game changers that are happening right now. What's holding it back? One thing that I think is fundamentally holding it back is that data is just, it's out there, but it's inaccessible, right? And so this is a pretty depressing internal indicator of what's going on. Every year, the CGIAR surveys 180,000 smallholder farmers. That's about 3 times more what the World Bank and Gates Foundation and so on do with the LSMS survey, which is the ultimate panel data, kind of that economists generally use globally to look at changes. 3 times that. The trouble is, it's not one survey of 180,000 smallholder farmers. It's about 1,000 surveys of different questions to these farmers. In some cases, we might be asking the same farm household the same question twice from different centers. It's kind of uncoordinated. It's being generated, but it's not available. If I wanted to find that data, it would take me a decade to kind of pull it all together. So this has to change. We have to make data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So this is a kind of central thing. We've got to create a data ecosystem. So now let me give you an example of if we create that, what would happen. So take out your cell phone. Joe, you're excused. All right? I'm going to give you a challenge. All right, so you got 60 seconds. Tell me, Andy Jarvis, something that might help me make a decision in the next 24 hours. Okay? So we'll just wait a few, some of you I can see are kind of figuring out, like kind of, you've got an amazing supercomputer in your pocket, in your hands. You've got all sorts of stuff that you can do, all right? So, all right, anything coming out? Anyone got anything for me? It's going to rain? Okay. Huh?
James, John, Jackie, and Javier are going to start a business selling T-shirts and have the title of Think Big, Be Bold, Be Presumptuous. You'd be a fantastic model for that.
Okay. All right. Good. Anything else?
Incoming meteors.
Incoming meteors. We could check that. All right. So.
I actually checked the same thing.
There's a big data meetup group in Cali with 478 members. It could be 479.
Oh, there we go. All right, so I could go into that. That sounds like a real geekathon, that one. So this is all information in the in 60 seconds. It's all information that is kind of useful, and that's because it's personalized, right? So personalized. I use my cell phone. I land in some airport somewhere. I check in a hotel. I immediately get a little text, and it says, "Hey, you've checked into this hotel. These are some of the great restaurants that are close by you." So that that's TripAdvisor stuff. But you've got countless number of these. We use it every day on our commute. Which roads to take? There's been a crash. I get a text. Just like 3 minutes before I normally leave CIAT, I get a text saying there's a crash on this road. Try a different route. Personalized information. So that is fundamentally changing things for us. Now the problem is this, right? So this is Imelda. She's a coffee grower, a coffee farmer, lives in Pescador, Cauca. Now tell her something useful. And the problem is there's no data ecosystem out there that's going to help her. And so we've got personalized information, real-time traffic, all of these things going on. There's no sensors, there's no information being generated within her farm. We've probably got access maybe to survey data if we spend a year trying to find it. But she's not going to be able to turn on a cell phone and immediately get the richness of information that we do. And that's really because just the data resources are not out there. And this is something that we're struggling with in the agricultural sector constantly. But if we get that, if we get sustained, personalized information services to farmers in the food systems, I think that this will be a true revolution in terms of farmers kind of eating data bite by bite, in the sense that using all of this collective knowledge and data streams to do a lot better. So this is something that the Gates Foundation did. They looked at they did a kind of foresight analysis of what would be the benefits of digitalized rural advisory systems. So instead of waiting for the extension worker to arrive on the motorbike and at the farm gate once every 6 months if they arrive at all, have digital advisory services, you know, so you're Siri, you know, hey Siri, that kind of thing. And so they did this foresight analysis, and there's some big numbers there. It could increase adoption rates by 50%. It could increase farmer income by 20 to 25%, increase yields, return in farmer income per dollar invested, like 10 times cost savings for public systems. Huge numbers, huge numbers. And so we get excited. And there's all sorts of research questions about how do we generate these things. There's a lot of snake oil out there. What are the methods? What are the approaches? What can we say? What can't we say? How do we develop these kinds of things? What are the institutional arrangements? How do we communicate this stuff effectively? So many questions. And one of the benefits of this is you know, I think this is a really interesting area to get also youth and look at gender issues in agriculture. So youth, for example, I mean, you know, the kind of, a lot of people are kind of saying, you know, they're leaving farming because it's just not sexy enough, right? But you know, bringing some kind of digital technology into the farming process is going to attract more youth. And also it's a means of kind of breaking down information and power relations within households through mobile phones. There are some issues to deal with, like for women are, for example, 14% less likely to have a phone than a man globally. So there are gender issues, but if we can turn this around and make this into a kind of transformational option, then that'd be great. So just to close, I mean, this is where we see big opportunities here. It's landing with this big data platform. So we have the platform for big data in agriculture. This is our bold kind of ambition here, is to solve agricultural development problems faster, better, and at greater scale. So how can we harness digital technology, digital agriculture to change a little bit the way we go about these things? It's named a platform because the CGIAR structure, we're a platform, but really what we are is an innovation hub by nature. And so we're wanting to look at kind of place the CGIAR in the center of this dialogue about what does this mean in developing agriculture? What are the opportunities, partnering up and solving some of these intractable problems. Impossible to do it alone, so this is kind of it's a partnership. These are some of the logos of partners that are involved in this. Some of you in the room here are active ones, but it's really about reaching out and tapping into new partnerships. We're looking to organize our data, convene, bring people together, and inspire. Put it into practice and show what it can do, right? And so we're structured around that. And so just a few of the kind of final, I'm getting there. So some of the kind of things that we've achieved, we're only 9 months in, but we have Ceres has landed. Ceres is going to be the kind of one-stop shop to go in and see all CGIAR data. So you go in there and you can search for submergence tolerance rice. And what it'll do is it'll look in all the databases from all the different centers and find any data sets out there that go at that. It's a beta level right now, but we're excited about this. We have communities of practice working on these things: crop modeling, data-driven agronomy, geospatial data, ontologies, making data talk together, socioeconomic data, getting those 180,000 surveys into visible and fair. We're trying to inspire. We had a call. These were problems that we identified. How do we reveal food system flows in real time? How do we monitor pests and diseases more effectively? How do we disrupt impact assessment? How do we empower data-driven farming? And so we put out a call for innovation in ideas around these, and we funded 5 ideas. I won't go into detail on those, but we've provided some funding for these to pilot and innovate around these topics. And we're writing up a kind of state-of-the-art of these in terms of an innovation process. So just to close, I mean, there's huge promise, but there are only a handful of success stories in smallholder systems. And so we have a lot of, we have a constant flow of kind of people coming to write up case studies of successes, but we need to get better at kind of plenty to learn from these and fail forwards on them, right? What doesn't work as well, and we as a kind of knowledge partner, I think, can help on that. Need appropriate technology for smallholder systems, new business models for this. And then some of the challenges: kickstart a sustainable data ecosystem, capacity building a new generation of agricultural scientists, so much more kind of data smart, data able agricultural scientists and field agronomists. providing the enable environment for services to be successful, and then this kind of evidence of the value for money, the impact on gender and youth, these kinds of questions. I'd just like to say, you can see I'm overly excited. I never stick to my time when I talk about this because I get too into it. So it's enormously exciting for me and I think for the institution. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. So with that, I'd like to ask Sarah and Greg to join Andy. And as you two are coming down, I'd like you to think about a very particular question. So you have to multitask, walk and think at the same time. The question is, or the phrase I'm going to give you is, there's not an app for that. And so Andy's really excited about the technology. There's obviously a very substantial technological component to this big data platform. But at the end, he presented us with some challenges. And so as you're reflecting a little bit on what Andy put forward, maybe think about it in these terms. There's not an app for that. What are the pieces of this that we need to have in place that are not fundamentally technological solutions, but that enable some of these major advances that Andy positioned as being possible? Sarah, we'll start with you, and then we'll move to Greg. I was told it's my job to put you guys on the spot, and yeah, of course.
Thanks for all the time to think about it.
Yeah. Well, you had the whole walk.
There's not an app for this.
Turn off.
Oh,
Just one click, quick. Yep.
on? All right. There's not an app for this. There actually isn't, and to me, I guess app, and the definition of app is not simply just mobile, it's just an application to enable some type of decision. There actually isn't a good app really anywhere in the world for smart lending models that actually merge credit risk of the institution or the farmer with market risk.
No, and that would actually involve data and technology, but also a human component, understanding risk, how we engage smallholders in that process, and the feedbacks between the two.
Yeah, small and large, to be
Okay.
honest, because it works in the US and in many parts of the world because of huge subsidies. So if you actually took away the farm bill in the US, I would question if the risk models sitting in credit institutions in the US would actually be smart enough.
Do you think we have things to learn from the places where these systems exist in order to apply those to the places where they're still very emergent? For instance, the case of the U.S. Do you think there's specific lessons learned in what's going on in the U.S. that we could take to other regions, or is the context completely different?
No, I think we have to, it's very context dependent, but B, they truly don't exist. I think where we can learn from it is in the energy market. So it has nothing to do with agriculture, but the energy markets, because of the lack of subsidies, have figured out how to marry these two components and actually create really interesting metrics for credit, which to me is one of the largest bottlenecks in ag.
Excellent, excellent. Greg, there's not an app for that.
As a way of stalling, how many people here use WhatsApp? Wow. Okay, so I was asked to use that to contact somebody here, and I had to ask, what is WhatsApp? So that's kind of my baseline here for starting on there's not an app for that. So maybe this will be, there's not an app for that I know about. And I don't know. I think in kind of our sphere, it's an app for kind of conveying what's going on in the sector. We heard so much divergence about what we're all supposed to be thinking about the sector. And I don't think that we can crystallize that for ourselves and express what's going on to the people in our system of kind of the development game, the communication that we're trying to get going here between our funding institutions and the institutions that are looking for funding. There's not an app for kind of conveying that information, I think.
Do you feel we're at risk in this particular instance with a big data platform and these types of approaches and finding ourselves in a position where we're always just preaching to the choir? Or do you feel like there's a natural sort of long tail here that's going to lead to adoption no matter what? Everything's already in motion, and everything's just going to work out. I mean, what are the possibilities that we might find ourselves just with the same people in the room every time and not really ever reaching the end game?
Well, Sarah may be in the choir. I'm definitely not. I really kind of don't get it. When I looked at the big data platform website, I was expecting to see something about science and what you alluded to in this new paradigm of science, where in the old days we were performing controlled experiments, very costly, always concerned about degrees of freedom and minimizing the non-treatment error effects. Whereas now if we have big data, it means lots of observations so that you don't need to invest in controlled experiments as much. You don't need to have such a structured model. You can detect correlations when you have 10 million observations that you couldn't get to before. So that was where I was coming from on this idea, rather than, I think the way John Lynham put it this morning was good. It's harvesting big data is kind of what the platform sounds like, is how do you harvest big data rather than putting big data out there.
Andy, could you maybe respond to this preaching to the choir issue?
I mean, you know, I think it's early days, so I get enormously excited. It's my job to get excited about these things to a certain extent. Yeah, but I think there's a hypothesis out there of, you know, is this actually going to deliver anything? You know, and I think, you know, there's a few great examples of these. You know, for example, information on seasonal forecasts and weather information getting to farmers and what that does in terms of their risk, how they change their risk profile and so on. So there's emerging kind of storylines and cases in the field of this happening. I think there's a lot to learn from it. And so, you know, we get excited about the big data in agriculture kind of opportunities, but as a research organization, I think one of our roles is to be critical and look at these things and, well, what is it generating? What is, you know, where are there undesired consequences of these kinds of issues? So, you know, in the platform, we're very interested in that, the kind of learning side of things. But yeah, you've got to get enthused about things to kind of get into them. So I'm overly excited about these things.
Sure. So one of the things that happens, one of the areas that we work here in CIAT is this idea of climate services, and it's about provision of data and information to help producers at many different scales make better decisions. But one of the sort of early findings with that was that we needed to really focus on the demand. If we were just generating information all the time, we weren't really sure the information or the data coming out of these climate service activities was actually in demand. Sarah, with Grow Intelligence and the sort of the provision of large data, what have you seen in terms of the demand for this type of information, agricultural intelligence information?
Yeah, I think the first thing in talking about big data, which actually is a term I almost don't use intentionally, is actually you want the consumer to feel like it's not difficult when they experience it, meaning they should not experience the technical complexity of what went on in the background for their experience with it. And so one of the things we really focused on, really with everything from climate and environmental data to market-related data, is figuring out a way in essentially saying, how do I like really break this down so that that person that I am sharing this with, any end user of our product, understands it in very basic ways. And it's something I found fascinating when I left. When I was trading at Morgan Stanley, we used to have an in-house, basically, meteorologist that literally whose job was just to interpret all the reports we were getting from external consultants, because none of them knew how to communicate in English. They only communicated in science. And my job is the market going to move up or down because of this climate-related event? And what does that actually mean? And one of the things that does, by having this type of structure in terms of science being such a bad communicator, or the scientific community doing a bad job of communicating, is that it creates massive barriers to entry for a lot of people who can't afford to hire a full-time meteorologist to interpret just these weather reports for them. And so what we basically said is, can we use machines to do that interpretation layer and just try to deliver that information in a way that, in some ways, it hurts you because you're like, you have no idea how painful this was to generate this report. But on the flip side, it's useful to their lives. And so I think that's probably one of the big things to keep in mind is really the big data part can happen on the back end, but the front end should seem as simple as possible.
Yeah. Andy reflected on the consumer of the information quite a bit. Have you worked with the consumers of the information that you're generating?
Yeah, so we work pretty much with everyone in the agricultural, like in the system, except for farmers. The only farmers we do work with are very large-scale commercial farmers, and part of it is because the decision-making tools that we've developed and the algorithms that we've built are really targeted towards making high-level macro decisions and kind of connecting the dots around the system. So for us, it's how do you get input providers, the credit system, governments, et cetera, to align on how they view the farmer, and then on the output side, think of logistics, food and beverage companies, et cetera. And our theory had always been, everybody actually kind of needs the same base level of information. They just act on it very differently. But at the end of the day, people want to know how much of a commodity is there, what's the demand, how does that move price? Like, it's actually that simple and so depressing when you break it down that way, but what are the components that go into determining supply and demand and then forecasting price as a result? That's a really complex problem.
Context specificity.
That's why.
So since I know everybody's hungry, I'm going to ask each one of our guests to have one parting thought with respect to what do you see as a big opportunity. So if you were to think about this, Greg, Sarah and Andy, and orient your thinking, if you were participating in this domain, what would you see as a big opportunity?
This one I think already has occurred, but I think it's the conveying of price information to farmers. That seems to be one that could be collected in a lot of ways and conveyed, as you say, kind of boiled down to what you really care about as a single byte of information.
Zara?
That was
me-
yours, right?
No, I actually think it's a piece of infrastructure, data infrastructure we don't talk about, which is actually physical sensors and weather stations and the right density that's actually needed to ensure agriculture. So when you look at one of the data points we track is actually how many active weather stations are there in any location in the world at any point in time. To truly do farmer insurance schemes, you need the right density of weather stations. No satellite data will get you there. It's no matter what people say, it doesn't really work financially, is actually building that right data infrastructure. And that's really, really cheap infrastructure to build. So if we take Africa as an example, Kenya and Texas are the same size. Kenya, on average, has about 32 active weather stations a day. Texas has about 1,000. Texas alone has all of sub-Saharan African active weather stations combined, of which 250 are in South Africa. To maintain the right density of weather stations to actually create farmer insurance schemes is a $100 million 10-year investment. I have not heard a single person talk about doing something like that, which that to me is a complete no-brainer as a starting point.
Fantastic. And Andy?
That's a good one.
Big opportunity.
I think, and this is now thinking a little bit of where CIAT's going, right? So we're always talking about sustainable food systems. We're kind of moving up into what I would call more amorphous kinds of things. It's not something you can see or grab. It's kind of everywhere. It's out there. And that makes it, from a science perspective, very hard to understand and to test and challenge and change, model, whatever. I think big data approaches, kind of getting streams of information on prices, on consumers, of what they're eating, where it's coming from, all of these things, trade. That's a big opportunity to understand these better, to make the food system less amorphous and more concrete.
Fantastic. I'm reading the subtitle here, And it's data is the flux capacitor of agriculture research, accelerating us into a future of sustainable, resilient food production where no one is left behind. I think that if we reflect on these major opportunities that were just highlighted, each one of those feeds very much into this idea that we should bring everybody forward together, and data is one of the catalysts in this process. So with that, let's thank our group.